day more and more into your image. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. So, I'm going to, being a teacher, by the way, we used to live in Michigan, right, around Andrews University, but my wife and I just last year, we moved down to Texas. So that's where I am teaching now as an assistant professor at Southwestern Adventist University. So I'm very much enjoying it there. I do have to say, being from Australia, that I don't miss the winter here at all. Although I was told it wasn't too bad of a winter, like you didn't get too much snow this year, which is a good thing. At least here, I don't know what it was like in Michigan. My guess is they got quite a bit. But I'm loving Texas winter. It reminds me much more of the Australian winter. But it's a pleasure for us to be here still. Now, let's go to the story of Joseph. We're going to pick up in Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37 is where this begins, and I want us to notice some details to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this story. And along the way, because I love to teach, I might ask some questions, and when I ask questions, please feel free to respond. I'll let you know if I'm asking a question that I don't want you to respond to, right? But otherwise, if I'm asking a question, I know you're all very good Bible students and that you study your Bibles, and this is a story that we're all familiar with, so I'd like to hear how much you remember. So let's start reading from verse 1 of chapter 37 in Genesis. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a what? A stranger. It says stranger in the land of Canaan. And this is the history of Jacob. Joseph being, how old was Joseph? 17. Okay, now we're not going to look at this for a long time, but I want you to remember that number, 17. Put that in the back of your mind. It's going to become significant towards the end of the sermon here. But he's 17 years old, and he was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah and his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. How was Joseph perceived amongst the group of his brothers? Have you ever heard the expression tattletale? You know, the one who always says, well, you know, what did we do? Well, we just, you know, went behind the building. Well, that's not really what we did. We were jumping off the trees and we shouldn't have been doing that, or whatever it is, right? So someone eventually says the truth of what's going on, and they get nicknamed the tattletale, right? They didn't keep the secret. And evidently it seems that Jacob had some problematic sons, right? I mean, anyone who has a son probably know. I know I don't have a son yet, but I remember what it was like to be a son. And, you know, you want to kind of, you have a bit more energy, you want to go out and do things, and it seems like, not to excuse any of it, but Jacob here has some sons, and particularly when they're together, it seems they're not doing everything that's right. And Joseph is kind of like the good son, right? The tattletale, who's coming back to his father and saying, by the way, do you know what my brothers did? They were doing this, this, and that. And of course, that probably got them into trouble, so you understand why they didn't really like Joseph and didn't want him to be around. So how does the story go? What's the profession that Jacob's sons have? They're shepherds, right? So they look after the sheep. And it says there that just before they go out, there's a dream that Joseph has. In fact, he has two dreams. What are these dreams? What's the first dream? Okay, the sheaves. Okay, very good. Next response has to come from someone else other than Janelle, right? So the sheaves first. So they're tying up, he has this dream, and as they're harvesting, they're bundling up the sheaves, and it seems like 11 of the sheaves bow down to his sheaf. He sees his brothers, they're tying them, and they all fall down while Joseph is staying upright. And he relays this to his brothers. He doesn't tell them what it means. He just says, this is what I saw. The brothers imply from this that, you know, do you think we're going to be bowing down to you, or what are we, you know, going to be doing? Then he has a second dream. What is his second dream? The stars and the moon and the sun, right? So he has a vision that he's up in space, I'm guessing, and he sees 11 stars, the sun and the moon, and I don't know how visually that takes place, but you know, how does something spherical bow? No matter which way you turn it, it's going to look the same. But in some way, Joseph understands the dream that they bow down to him. and he relays the dream again and again. This just further alienates Joseph from his brothers, right? They already don't like him, but now he's having dreams that they will one day bow down to him, and they're like, as if that is ever going to happen. So even his father has to rebuke him and kind of tell him, Joseph, stay quiet, don't share that. But he's keeping it in the back of his mind. Why do you think Jacob, and this we read about in verse 11 of the chapter here, I'll just read very quickly. And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Why do you think Jacob was a little bit less likely to quickly ridicule Joseph? Thought it might have been prophetic. Why do you think he might think that? Let me ask you another question. Has Jacob had experiences about dreams? Yes. So he knows what it's like to receive a dream from God. He knows that God is faithful and that God usually reveals things that are going to happen. So he's aware of what the dream is, and he's telling Joseph, okay, enough. You've shared the dream enough. Maybe Joseph was trying to gloat in it or whatever it is. But he says enough about that, but he's keeping it in the back of his mind because he knows if God gave this dream, then he knows it's certainly going to come true. At least that's what his experience has been. So he does that. Then we know that the brothers went, it says here that they went to Shechem, this is the very next verse, in verse 12, to feed their sheep. Now, does anyone know roughly, this is like going above and beyond, how far away Shechem was from Hebron, which is where Jacob and his sons were living? Okay, it's approximately 60 miles. I mean, that's a significant distance to go to take sheep, right? Obviously, they didn't go there in one day, but this was several days' journey just to get there, where there was grass enough and water enough for the sheep to eat and drink, and so that they could be sustained. And you can imagine all the days they would have had to travel to get there. The sons, however long they were staying there and taking care of their sheep, don't send any word to their father to say, we're doing okay. We're safe, we're sound, we're together. The sheep are doing well. Like, no report has been given to him. So Jacob says, hey, it's been quite some time and I haven't heard back from your brothers. Can you go and see them? You're not going to be traveling with sheep, so it'll be a little faster to you. And Joseph says, does he say he'll go, or does he say he doesn't want to go? He says he'll go, right? Imagine that, 60 miles. How many of you would travel 60 miles on foot, carrying food and provisions with you, partaking of them very, very sparingly because you want to be able to give it to your brothers there who you're not exactly sure what situation they are in? So he says yes. And when he gets there, he doesn't find them. And then he talks with someone. I'm paraphrasing here for the sake of time, so we don't spend too much time on reading some of these texts. But those who were there, he questioned them, says, have you seen my brothers? And say, yes, they were here, but they actually left and they went to Dothan. Now, from Shechem to Dothan is another 12 miles. So another half-day journey at least to get there if you're walking, another couple of hours to get there. And Joseph, says, okay, so now he's traveled 72 miles on foot to meet his brothers. And just, can you imagine traveling on foot 72 miles to meet family and to be expecting to be like, hey, Joseph. But instead you're greeted with, Joseph, what are you doing here? You coming to report us to our father again, or whatever it is? I mean, can you see the kind of reception that he might have assumed he would have gotten is not the one that he actually received? And so this is what the story is. We know the story, right? They take him and they do what to Joseph? They sell him, right? They throw him in the pit first. They take the food that he brought with him. They don't really share the food with him. They eat it. Just imagine throwing your own flesh and blood into a pit and then having lunch around him while he's there saying, please let me out. Please, I'll just go home, whatever it is. And they actually intended to kill him originally, right? That's what they spoke. Let's kill him. Let's be rid of him. He's such a thorn in our side. He's our enemy. And Reuben is the one. This is the eldest brother who is able to convince the rest of the brothers that they should rather throw him in the pit rather than rather than kill him. And Reuben is intending later, when the brothers kind of disperse or when they leave, he will eventually get Joseph out and bring him back to his father. This is what Reuben's planning, but he doesn't tell his brothers anything. He's going with the flow. What do we call this today? When you get in a group of peers and everyone feels pressured to do something. Peer pressure, right? It happens in the family, it happens in the workplace, it happens in school. Don't think that it only happens in school, right? Even after school, there's a kind of pressure that you feel in terms of, should I be going with the flow or should I be standing for the right and for the truth? And sometimes this doesn't have to be opposing one another, but sometimes it is. Sometimes standing for the truth means that you will have certain consequences in your life. So Joseph, is down in the pit, and all of a sudden, let's read verse 26. And note who's speaking here. So Reuben says, let's not kill him, let's throw him in the pit. We know what his plan is. But then notice verse 26, it says, so Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And the brothers listened. So there were these Midianite traders that were heading down to Egypt, and Judah seems to come up with the idea, let's sell him rather than kill him. After all, he is our brother, right? So we shouldn't really kill him. How can we do that? But this way we can all have some money in our pocket for what we do. And so that is what they do. Reuben, it seems, is not there. We are told that he is sold for 20 shekels or 20 pieces of silver. Jesus was also betrayed, but he was sold for 30 pieces of silver. So if you're looking for a biblical kind of type or a representation for inflation, you have one there where, it takes a long time, but yes, from 20 to 30 pieces of silver. Joseph is sold, and we know what they do with his coat, right? They take it, they slaughter a lamb or a kid of the goats, and they dip his blood in it, and then they present it to their father. And what they see is not exactly what they expected. I want you to note that when you're amongst people who think doing evil is good, in the moment it seems like it's good. But afterwards you have a bitter, bitter pill to swallow. And this is what happens to Jacob's sons. They go back and they give the tunic, and Jacob, verse 34 here, it says, Jacob tore his clothes, he put sackcloth on his waist, and he mourned for his son many days. And notice what verse 35 says, and all his sons, not some of his sons, all his sons and all his daughters, that's the daughters-in-law, arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. And so his father wept for him. Now the Midianites, were told, sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. So this is the beginning of the story. It's not sounding like a great story, is it? We're familiar with the ending, so we know it has a happy ending. But for right now, it's quite horrible. How many of you would have loved to be Joseph in this family? No one's raising their hand, right? For good reason. It's not a beautiful situation. Then it seems in this story we almost have an interlude, right? It talks about Joseph and his brothers, and then we come to chapter 38 and we have this incident that happens between Judah and Tamar. Okay, now without going into the specific details, let's summarize a few details of the story. Judah is one of Jacob's sons. How many sons does Judah have in the story? Does anyone remember how many sons Judah has? He has 3 sons. Okay, 3 sons. The oldest son ends up getting married, but he ends up dying. He says he did wickedly in front of God. God was displeased with him, and he dies. And so Judah comes to the second son and says, you should marry your sister-in-law and you should raise up an heir for your brother so that his name is not taken away from the earth. But did he listen? No. So what does God do to him? God kills him as well. So notice in this story, I just want you to notice, what have they done to Jacob, their father in the story before. They have essentially killed, even though they didn't literally kill. They had gone to the point of no return where they couldn't do anything but lie. And they told their father, without using the words, Joseph is dead. They weren't able to console him. Notice now, Judah is not losing one son, but two sons. Notice what's happening here. Judah has a family. Judah is married. He's having sons. The sons are growing. The sons are getting married. They're starting to have families. Like, I think that this is giving us some insight into not just what Judah is going through, but what all of Joseph's brothers are going through. They're all getting married. They're all starting to have children. They're all of a sudden, I'm not sure if I can say maturing is the word. They're probably thinking back, why did we do what we did to Joseph? What were we thinking? Like, can you imagine if we lost one of our children, and some of them evidently did? I mean, we know that this was pressing on their minds, because when we come to the point in the story where Joseph accuses his brothers of being spies and puts them in prison, what's the first thing that they say? God is repaying us for what we did to Joseph, right? We deserve this. Like, it would have been over 20 years that this time has gone by, and yet the first thing on their minds is, what were we thinking? Why did we do this? God is repaying. They realize what they have done has been so horribly wrong. But we're not there yet, but we're getting there. But I want you to see that in chapter 38, that even though you kind of wonder, like, what is this doing in the middle of the Joseph story? It's giving you a picture of what is taking place in the heart of Judah. You know, at the end of this story, Judah is humble enough to say Tamar was more righteous than he was. Kind of hard to see that any one of the brothers would be willing to go that low just one chapter earlier, when they were just willing to do anything, even kill their own brother just to be rid of him. But all of a sudden now, he's much more subdued, much more humble. And I think that this is showing us a bit of insight again into what is happening in the family. So again, we're up to chapter 39 now. And Joseph is in Egypt, and he is sold to, who was he sold to again? Potiphar, okay? Who is Potiphar? Is he a low-ranking individual in Egypt or a high-ranking individual in Egypt? High-ranking, okay? Why is this a good thing for Joseph? Good benefits, right? It's a job with good benefits. Joseph, we're told in the spirit of prophecy that it's because of Joseph's role in Potiphar's house and the fact that he was bought by someone who was higher up in Egypt's, I don't know, I wouldn't call it democracy, but in their government, let's say. It helped him to rub shoulders with people. It helped him to gain an education in things which would later on be very, very important to him as being prime minister, as it were, or being second, except for Pharaoh himself, in the whole land of Egypt. A lot of the skills which Joseph learned, a lot of the people that he was able to interact with was only possible because he was bought by Potiphar. So notice that even though, well, I'm not going to say it yet because I think it's more dramatic just in a little while. So does Joseph prove himself in Potiphar's household? Yes. I mean, over and over again, if you read chapter 39, one thing that you are going to find happening over and over again, which happens more than any other chapters in the story of Joseph, is this. And you read about it in verse 2 of chapter 39. It says, the Lord was with Joseph. That is, don't just gloss over that. It's mentioned several times in this chapter. It's mentioned so much that God was with him that others took note that God was with him, right? Potiphar knew he had a good thing when he got Joseph, and he promotes him to head of his whole household. In fact, he says, when people asked him, oh, Potiphar, how are you going? Like, how's business? Talk to Joseph. I have no idea. All I know is I come home at this time and there's food for me at my table. I eat and then I go about my day. That's all I know. Everything else, you want to know how it is? You have to go talk to Joseph. He's in charge of everything. And God was blessing and blessing. God was blessing. Why? Because God was with him. And you find this over and over again. He becomes success. In fact, you often see in this chapter the dynamic of Joseph being successful tied in with either just before or just after because God was with him. You know, true success in life doesn't come with how much money you have in your bank account, how many houses you own, what is your net worth today. You know, everyone is Googling who is what's net worth, you know. Net worth, you know, in terms of success, should be based on, is God with you? Is God working in your life? Now, look at Joseph. Joseph, for all intensive purposes, you can say, yeah, he's high up. He's head of Potiphar's household, but Joseph is a slave. And yet Joseph is successful. In a little while, we find that Joseph becomes a prisoner, and Joseph is still successful. Why? Because God is still with him. I mean, this notion of being with God, having, you know, God being with you is what brings true success. That you can't mistake that in this passage. And so we go through, and then what happens towards the end of this chapter? Potiphar's wife sees Joseph, and she wants to lie with him, and Joseph is unwilling. This happens over and over again. This isn't an incident that just happens once. Many times she's approaching Joseph, and Joseph is turning her down. And finally, there's this one day that happens where she grabs a hold of his coat, and Joseph just leaves his coat behind and runs out of the house. And she did not appreciate that, and she accuses him of basically wanting to try and lie with her. Now, I want you to note that at the end of this chapter, we have the notion of, or not quite at the end, but let me relay it this way. If Potiphar had really believed his wife, do you think he would have put Joseph in prison? Being an officer of the guard, there's a very quick way to sort out people that you don't like. You make them disappear, and they never bother you again. If Potiphar really believed his wife and didn't believe Joseph, looking at the life of Joseph, he never would have put him in prison. He would have killed him on the spot, and that would have been the end of it. The reason why he was thrown in prison was because Potiphar knew deep down that Joseph did not do this thing. And Joseph probably talked to him and said, you know me. You've seen what I've been doing. Do you think God would have been blessing me if this is what I've been doing behind your back? You have a choice to make. Decide to believe me or decide to believe my wife. And Potiphar evidently tried to choose a middle ground where he didn't have to kill Joseph, but at the same time, he wanted to honor his wife, even though he didn't believe her, right? And so rather than saying, I don't believe you, and maybe there was some kind of a political statement that he wanted to make with that or do with that, or was afraid that he would lose something if he would believe a slave over his wife, and what would that be seen publicly? So for fear of that, he decides, I'm going to put Joseph in the prison. Notice, we do many things because of peer pressure. You see this over and over again in this story, coming back and forth. But then we get to chapter 40, and now Joseph is in the prison. And what's taking place in the prison? Joseph just does nothing. He cries, oh, woe is me. Why am I going through this? He comes there and he says, what can I do to help? And you can imagine the look on the guard's face. That must be like, you want to help? I mean, who does that, right? Okay, you can do this. He sees that Joseph does a good job in that. You can do this. And eventually the guard says, this is the best prisoner I've ever had. You run the prison. You just report to me so that when they come to ask me, I at least know what's going on, right? Otherwise, I might lose my head, and that won't be a good thing. But essentially, there's this experience that happens even in the prison, where the chief kind of butler and baker of the king are thrown into prison. They somehow displease Pharaoh, and he throws them in prison. And they have two dreams. Does Joseph know a thing or two about dreams? He's had some earlier dreams, but he acknowledges that dreams, can man interpret another man's dreams? I mean, he could try, but ultimately, who knows what dreams really mean? God does. And so he tells them, doesn't God know the interpretation of dreams? He's like, why don't you share them with me? Evidently, there was something about Joseph, something about the way in which he lived, that when people were around him, they knew there was something special about him. They listened to him. I mean, this happens over and over again in the story. Evidently, Potiphar listened to him when he was falsely accused. And evidently, the prison guard, the chief guard, listened to him when they saw what he was like. And here we have even the butler and the baker that listen to Joseph. So the butler has his dream, this vine that has 3 branches and grapes grow on it, and he's going to grab the grapes and he squeezes them, basically crushes them into a cup, and he gives them to Pharaoh. And Joseph tells him, in 3 days, which is what the 3 branches are, Pharaoh is going to reinstate you to your position. Oh, that sounded like really good. So the baker says, oh, I can't wait to tell him my dream. Maybe it's good news for me. There was bread, 3 baskets of bread, and I was holding them, and all the birds came and basically ate from out of it. And Joseph, unfortunately, has to tell him, in 3 days, you're not going to be reinstated. You're going to be disappeared, right? You're going to be taken away. Now, what does Joseph say immediately to the butler after he tells him the interpretation of his dream? We're going to read this in Genesis chapter 40, verse 14, exactly, yeah. It says, when he told him this manner, the interpretation of a dream, it says, but remember me when it is well with you. In other words, when Pharaoh reinstates you, please don't forget me. He even uses the word remember, right? Remember me when you settle in and everything is great and your position is secure. Please remember me. He says, please show kindness to me and make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me in the dungeon. What does Joseph just want to do? He just wants to go home, right? Please remember me. Let me go home. You don't have to apologize to me. I don't need a big fanfare. I don't need a horse. Please just let me go out of here and I will start walking home. I'll make my own way because I was stolen. And I've done nothing here in Egypt while I've been here that merits me being in this place. And yet, what happens? Always when you start with remember, you know what's going to happen, right? People forget. The Sabbath commandment, remember. Everyone forgets. I mean, there's so many stories. Remember, remember, remember. It's probably the first thing you're going to forget, right? Sometimes even when we're busy, Sabbath morning, I need to get this, or I'm traveling, make sure to pack this. And then when you're already on the road, you're like, oh, should have put that when I was thinking of it, right? We all have our moments where we forget things. So he's very specific here, remember me, but he gets forgotten. I want you to just put yourself in Joseph's shoes. You relate to your family the dreams which God has given you, and they reject you. You go in Potiphar's house, and you say, I'm going to do good by this man. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to show myself valuable to him. And when push comes to shove, he rejects you as well. And then you go to the prison, and you work your way up in the prison, and you do kindness to those who come there, and you relay the dreams of others, and you say, please remember me, and they forget you. Does this sound like God is with you? In terms of success, we would certainly say, Joseph, things are not looking good for you. The fact that this land, there's a reason why he named his children the names that he named them. And we're going to get to that. But this notion of that Joseph feels abandoned by everyone along the way, and yet still he is clinging to God, and yet still he is doing what is faithful. Not to say that he never sinned, right? Paul tells us all have sinned. So even Joseph committed sins, but evidently not big enough that it was worthy of prison. But this notion that as imperfect as Joseph was, he was doing the right thing to the best of his ability. And God was blessing him even though it doesn't seem like God was blessing him. No doubt in this prison, he also rubbed shoulders with some people who took note of him and noticed how he was leading and guiding and managing. And so then we come to chapter 41. And what happens in chapter 41? Pharaoh has some dreams. 2 dreams again. What's the first dream? Cows. Okay? Fat cows. Like Texan cows. One thing that I'm noticing in Texas is everywhere I drive, there are just cows everywhere. Anyway, fat cows. Lots to eat. And then 7 thin cows. Spindly, bone and skin, kind of drought and famine, they don't look very healthy. And the 7 thin cows eat the 7 fat cows, and they still look just as thin as they were at the beginning. What was the second dream about? Say it a bit louder. I feel like I hear someone, but corn, okay, or grain, like the stalks of grain, and there were 7 that were like extremely plump, right, full and fat, showing that, you know, plenty of rain, plenty of nutrients. And then there were 7 thin ones that barely had anything on them, maybe, you know, very thin, and they somehow eat up the 7 fat ones, and again, nothing, they look exactly the same. And this, at this time, God brings back to remembrance, or maybe the butler, I mean, he sort of comes in before Pharaoh very ashamed, right? Very saying, oh, please forgive me. I forgot about this person that I was supposed to remember in the prison. And he relays to him the fact of what happened. We're not exactly sure how much earlier, but I would estimate that it was several years. And he brings back to Pharaoh this news that there is someone in your prison who can interpret dreams. This is what happened to me and the baker all those years ago. Do you remember that? And he relayed the dreams that we had, and it came to pass just as he told us. Maybe he can tell you what this dream means. And so Pharaoh invites him in, and we are told that Joseph again gives God glory and honor. There's a lot of similarities between this story and Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar, right? We have this notion of, again, Daniel coming and interpreting the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. There are differences as well, but there are a lot of similarities that we can find there. And then Joseph gives him the interpretation. He not only gives him the interpretation, but he gives him the solution, right? He says, this is what the dreams mean, and this is how you can avoid dying out, because the famine is going to be so severe that you won't even remember the 7 years of plenty. And he gives that counsel, and he says, you should elect someone to be overseer of all of this. And Pharaoh says, thank you. And he goes and he visits with his counselors and advisors, and they tell him, listen, who better are you going to find than this person? Evidently, they had to ask, why was he in prison? I'm curious. I don't think we'll find out until heaven, but I'm curious as to whether or not they called Potiphar in. I said, can you tell us a little bit about Joseph? He probably would have to say, listen, if I really believed him, he'd be dead. The reason I put him in the prison is because I don't believe him. He was a fantastic worker. I gave everything into his hand, and I was sorry that I had to put him in prison. I mean, I'm curious as to who exactly were Pharaoh's counselors and what they heard about Joseph, that immediately they come back and they say, you know what, you're going to be this person. Only in the throne am I going to be higher than you. He takes off his ring. He gives his ring, which means he can seal, official documents. And all of a sudden, Joseph is now, besides Pharaoh, the highest ruler in the land. And what's the first thing that he does? He goes to Potiphar's house and he goes, going to get you back for what you did to me. Right? No, he doesn't. Time to make the plan to survive this famine, which is going to be coming. And it's just a beautiful story that tells us a lot of Joseph, it seems, and this is even more evident when we come to when he sees his brothers. He doesn't hold on to any bitterness, does he? He seems to let it roll off his back, kind of like water off a duck's back. He's not holding on to the disadvantages that he's had, the persecution, the trials. He still seems to be going forward, willing to serve. Then we get to the story of when his brothers arrive. And when his brothers arrive, what does Joseph accuse them of being? He says, you guys are actually spies, right? You're here to search out Egypt. To which they reply, no. And he asks them pointedly about the family. Obviously, they don't know how he's asking this question. Do you have a father? Do you have another brother? Oh, yes, we do. And he gets this information out of them. And then he says, no, you're still spies. And he puts them all into prison. The first thought in their minds, God is paying us back for what we've done to Joseph. Now, mind you, Joseph, the Bible tells us, I'm not going to read it here. Does anyone remember how old Joseph was when he became the prime minister of Egypt? He was 17 when he was sold as a slave, and he was 30 when he actually appeared before Pharaoh, and he was, kind of received his position as prime minister. So 13 years in Potiphar's house and the prison. We don't know exactly, was it 7 and 6 or how it was divided, but a certain number of years in Potiphar's house, and that 13 years, and now he's prime minister. Then we know that there's another 7 years of the plentiful years, right? So now he's 37, And probably his family, my guess is they're coming the year after, right? Because that year was a good year. And so they were able to manage. So it was only when the next year kind of didn't bring forth food that they're starting to think, what are we going to do, right? This first year of famine, which was the following year. So Joseph is probably around 38, I'm guessing, speculating a little bit, when this is taking place. And they come, he accuses them of spies, he puts them all into prison. He leaves them there for 3 days. And then he comes and he says, okay, I fear God, you should go back to your families. I don't want them to starve and to suffer. But one of you is going to remain behind. And he picks Simeon and he keeps him in prison. Simeon, we're told by the spirit of prophecy, he was one of the earliest who said he should be the one who's killed. He should be the one that's trapped. And so he was one of the instigators. And then he goes and he stays in prison and the rest return. What else does Joseph do in terms of their grain sacks? He puts their money back in the grain sack, doesn't he? So he loads them with plenty of grain, but then he puts their money back. And as they stop to feed their donkeys, their caravan, they notice, oh, my money is there. When they get back to home, they all open up their bags and they find all of our money is back here. They're like, what is God doing to us? He really wants to punish us bad. I mean, just think of that. God is blessing them, but do you see what guilt can do? Guilt makes you perceive the blessing as though it's really a curse. Interesting point there. I didn't see it that way before either, so it just came to me now. So they stay there. They, last as long as they can until that grain runs out, and then they start coming to their father and saying, we really need to go back down to Egypt, don't we? And what does Jacob say? No, I've already lost Joseph. And now Simeon is in prison. How can I let Benjamin go? I might not see him again, and then I'm going to be completely distraught. But they keep working on him. Reuben keeps saying, we need to do this. I want you to notice this in verse, I went a little bit too far here. In verse 32, when they return back, notice another interesting part of the story here is in verse 31 of chapter 42. It says, when Joseph's accusing them of being spies, it says, but we said to him, we are honest men and we are not spies. That's actually how they replied to him. We're not spies, we're honest men. Were they honest? Didn't they lie about the fact that Joseph died? Even though maybe they didn't say the words, but they were lying. I mean, and yet they're saying they're honest men. And Joseph wants to see, is that true? Are they honest men? Have they changed? Or are they still the same? So they go down there. Reuben speaks to his father and he says, kill my 2 sons if I don't bring back Benjamin to you, right? So they're getting desperate. You can see that. And it really isn't until Judah speaks with Jacob. And I want you to note the words which Judah says to Jacob. It says, the man solemnly, Jacob, their father, is saying, you need to go back and buy more food. And Judah comes to him and says, listen, the man told us that he will not let us go unless we see the younger brother with us. He said, why did you deal with me? And Judah says, listen, he asked us point blank questions. How's your father? Do you have a father? Do you have another brother? How are we supposed to know that he would ask us to bring our younger brother? In other words, if we had known, we wouldn't have said anything, but we didn't know. And then he says this, verse 8, send the lad with me and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and also our little ones. I want you to see a bit of the compassion that Judah has now. He's concerned for the children. Forgetting, I'm thinking years earlier now, at least 20 years earlier, right? Joseph's 37, 38, at least 20 years earlier, about how poorly they treated Joseph, who was a child of his father. And now they have children of their own and they're concerned for them. They're starting to understand why their father is so sad upon losing Joseph. And so he says, okay, go. I mean, what choice did he have? Take Benjamin with you. Take extra money with you. Take some extra gifts with you. I mean, do everything you can to make sure that you are not thrown into prison a second time. And they go down. And Joseph tests them a second time. And we know the story just for sake of time. Again, he puts that cup into Benjamin's sack. And as they're leaving, his officers basically arrest them, bring them back. Joseph says, why did you steal from me? They said, we didn't steal from you. And he said, whoever's sack contains the cup, that's who's going to stay and be my slave forever. And they go through from the oldest to the youngest, and they open up Benjamin's one, and now Benjamin has to remain and be with Joseph forever, and they don't know this. And who do you think is the one who speaks up? Who's the one who has been transformed maybe the most out of his brothers? Judah. Judah's the one who speaks up. And he says, basically here, it says, let me read to you here. Sorry, it's before he ran there. Okay, it's towards the end of chapter 44. And it says, basically Judah tells him, listen, this is my father. This is how old he is. And unless we return to him with Benjamin, he will die. And we don't want to do that. So I'm going to start reading from verse 27. It says, then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons, and the one went out from me. And I said, surely he's torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. But if you take this one also from me, and calamity befalls him, you shall bring down my gray hair with sorrow to the grave. Now therefore, when I come to your servant, my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will happen when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he will die. So your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant, your father, with sorrow to the grave. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I will bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the lad as a slave to my lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest perhaps I see the evil that would come upon my father? Judah is here saying, I will stay on behalf of Benjamin. And Joseph can't take any more. And he tells everyone to go out of his house. He reveals himself to his brothers, and he tells his father and sends message to his father with wagons and with chariots, come down and live in Egypt, because the famine is going to last still another 5-6 years. And you need to be here, otherwise you're going to be brought to poverty. And Jacob hears the news. I mean, I can't imagine what it must have been like. Number one, the shock factor of the brothers finding out. Number two, having to go back to their father and tell them what actually took place. Can't keep secrets anymore, right? Now they have to confess and say, no, we actually sold Joseph. I mean, I can't imagine Jacob hearing that and saying, you did that? For 20-something years, you haven't told me that? I mean, we could have gone back and tried to find him, tried to buy him back. I mean, what were you doing? It's not as though forgiveness is impossible, right? But why are you just keeping it secret? I mean, they must have had some interesting conversations, I'm sure. But I want you to notice one more thing here as we get towards the end. Judah not only shows us how much compassion he had, he not only shows us how much he grew, he not only shows us a type of Christ, right, that he'd be willing to take the place of Benjamin, much like Christ is willing to take our place and die. But I want you to notice in chapter 47, verse 28. 47, verse 28. And this is what it says. Jacob, when he finally came to Egypt, it says, he lived in the land of Egypt how many years? 17 years. Remember I told you at the beginning to keep that number in the back of your minds? When we often look at the story of Joseph, we often see in Joseph a type of whom? Who does Joseph remind us of? Christ, right? And there's good reason for that. But I want to suggest to you that the story of Joseph is also a type of you and me, not a type of Christ. How long was Joseph with his father in the beginning? 17 years. And how long was he with his father at the end? 17 years. When God originally created humanity, how long were we supposed to live with him? And when this whole process or this this sin problem is finally done away with, how long are we going to live with our Father? The same amount of time as we were supposed to live with him in the beginning. I just find that so interesting. Not only that, but if you go to verses, let me see, I've gone a little bit too far. When Joseph rises, let's turn back to chapter 41, verses 51 and 52. So Genesis 41, verses 51 and 52. And notice the names that Joseph gives to his children. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all of my father's house. And number 2, we have the name of the second child. He called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. I just want you to note this as a really important lesson as we conclude here, that while we live in this land of affliction, and it doesn't matter where we live in the world, anywhere you live, even in the best places in the world, sin is still there. And there is affliction. When you seek to do the right, you're going to suffer because of it. God can make us fruitful. God can bless us enough one day that we will look back on our time on earth and we will say, we've forgotten that. It seems like nothing. You know, Ellen White tells us when we walk through the heavenly gates, we're going to look back on our lives and we're going to try to bring up the hardest thing we ever went through. And we're all going to exclaim, heaven is cheap enough. That there is nothing that we can really recall that it's like, well, that was really bad, because compared to what God is waiting for us, there's nothing here that can even hold a wick to it, right? Or can even hold a candle, as it were, to that. So hopefully you've seen a few more insights in the story of Joseph, seen something a little bit different. We see a lot of growth that's happening in Joseph. We see a lot of growth that's happening in his brothers. And I hope that in terms of the big picture of the story, you see a story of a man who was taken away from his father and who was one day able to be reunited with his father. Much like sin has separated us from God, and God is seeking to deal with it so that one day we can see him face to face again. And we will have the same amount of time with him as we originally were supposed to have. I find that just so beautiful, that God works in this way and that God has given us these stories to give us hope, to give us courage, and to hopefully encourage us to live more like Joseph, who was really living more like God, right? So we should look to Jesus and we should seek to be more like him, even though we are living in the land of affliction. I believe now we're going to